I've said many times that Russia has always been, is, and will always be an extremely aggressive state. And the main goal of the Russian Federation is not to establish internal order or to provide a more or less normal life for ordinary Russians. No, not at all. The Russian Federation's nature has always involved seizing foreign territories and cynically enslaving other peoples. At the same time, it didn't matter at all what the state itself was called: Muscovy, an empire, the Union of Indestructible Free Republics, or a federation. Although, in essence, Russia has always been a federation only on paper. The Brezhnev Doctrine is a strong example of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics' imperial and expansionist nature, though it has been largely forgotten in recent decades. However, it was this doctrine that actually defined the basics of Moscow's foreign policy toward its neighbors for almost the entire second half of the 20th century. And now, in fact, there is a deliberate revival of the Brezhnev Doctrine. Only this time, it comes under the guise of the well-known Russian world and blatant great power chauvinism. So what is the Brezhnev Doctrine? And what does it mean? When and under what circumstances was it applied? What were the consequences of its practical implementation? All this and more right now. My name is Semyon, and this is the Mega Show television channel. Let's get started. What is the Brezhnev Doctrine? Before discussing the Brezhnev Doctrine, we first need to explain what is meant by a doctrine in politics. In this case, a doctrine is a certain system of principles, views, and ideas that define the strategic and political position of a state or political organization. To put it simply, a doctrine is a general course that should be followed to achieve a certain goal. Most often, doctrines specifically concerned a state's foreign policy and were formalized as a specific document or several documents, but not always. Another notable fact is that doctrines are usually named after their author. For example, the Truman Doctrine or the Reagan Doctrine. Now, as for the Brezhnev Doctrine, it never existed as a single unified document or a collection of laws. This term was coined in the late 1960s by a group of Western experts and journalists who were covering the aggressive foreign policy of the Soviet Union. Its meaning was that Moscow never considered the so-called states of socialist orientation to be full-fledged subjects of international relations, and therefore it reserved the right to intervene in their internal affairs at any moment, including by using military force. Now, a little more detail. During the Cold War, there were many countries in Eastern and Central Europe, as well as in other parts of the world, that looked up to the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, imitated the Soviet political and economic system, and considered Moscow their main partner and protector. Examples include Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Cuba, Laos, Vietnam, Angola, and Mozambique. And the leadership of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, in turn, did not consider them fully independent states and tried in every possible way to control their policies, so that, God forbid, these unruly servants would not show independence and break away from the authority of their master in the Kremlin. This was precisely the meaning of the Brezhnev Doctrine, or the doctrine of limited sovereignty, as it was often called by experts at the time. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics and its satellites. But before we analyze how the Brezhnev Doctrine worked in practice, let's recall a bit about how the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics came to dominate other countries, especially in Eastern Europe. And here we need to remember that the leader of all peoples, Joseph Stalin, like other Soviet figures, remained faithful to the ideas of Marx, Engels, and Lenin about the necessity of carrying out a world revolution until his dying day. Therefore, the entire foreign policy of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was primarily aimed at spreading communist tyranny throughout the world. Well, the carefully prepared Great Liberation Campaign of the Red Army, which was planned for June 1941, was ruined because of Hitler's treacherous and deceitful attack. Sovietizing Europe had to be abandoned, at least for a while. We have a video about the failed Red Blitzkrieg, so I recommend watching it to expand your knowledge about the expansionist nature of the Soviets. In 1944, there was a chance to partly make up for it as Soviet troops started liberating Central and Eastern European countries from Nazi occupation. However, in reality, the brown occupation was quickly replaced by the red one. However, back then, few people understood this. In the eyes of an ordinary Bulgarian, Hungarian, or Pole, the Red Army soldier was seen as a liberator from Hitlerism, as a friend, as a brother. However, the big brother from Moscow turned out to be somewhat strange and rather arrogant, and more he began to resemble a highway bandit. After defeating Germany, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics kept its troops in the liberated territories and even increased its military presence. And moreover, the occupied countries of Eastern Europe began to resemble the Soviet Union more and more. The same collective farms, the same shortage of goods, the same only correct point of view, and repression against dissenters. It's basically a miniature version of the Soviet system. The Soviet special services also carried out a number of operations to eliminate political opposition or simply undesirable individuals. For example, President Edvard Beneš of Czechoslovakia actively advocated for the democratic development of his country and did everything possible to resist the establishment of a communist dictatorship. But in June 1948, he was removed from power, and less than 3 months later, he died suddenly under rather strange circumstances. And there are plenty of similar examples in other countries. The only exceptions were Yugoslavia and Albania. Although one-party regimes were established here, their leaders, Josip Broz Tito and Enver Hoxha, were not eager to mindlessly follow orders from Moscow. Being staunch communists, they still preferred to follow their own path. The Yugoslav example was especially illustrative in this regard, when its leader Tito skillfully maneuvered between East and West for 3 decades, gaining the maximum benefit from it. We also have a separate video about the peculiarities of Yugoslavia's development. However, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics gained complete control over 6 other European countries: Poland, Romania, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, Hungary, and East Germany, then called the German Democratic Republic. This control was expressed not only by the presence of Soviet army units on their territory. The political system of these countries was almost completely copied from the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. The ideology was the same: Lenin, the party, the Komsomol, only with a slight adjustment for national specifics. Everyone was building communism in their country, even unwillingly. The Committee for State Security controlled all these states' security services. This subordination can be seen at least in the example of our old acquaintance, Vladimir Vladimirovich, when he served in the glorious German city of Dresden. We also have a separate video on Putin's foreign assignment and overall career in the security services. But to firmly cement such a strong friendship and finally tie the wayward younger brothers to itself, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics established 2 structures: the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, and its own version of NATO, the Warsaw Pact Organization. The Council for Mutual Economic Assistance linked Eastern European economies to the Soviet Union, while the Warsaw Pact Organization legitimized Soviet military occupation. Soviet troops and nuclear weapons were stationed on their territory strictly under international legal norms. By the way, a couple of words about the NATO military political bloc so hated by Moscow. It was created in 1949 precisely as a logical and fair response by Western countries, primarily the United States, to the total Sovietization of Eastern Europe. So, no matter what Kremlin propaganda claims, if there had been no export of communism beyond the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, there would have been no NATO itself, and not the other way around. Here they are, the cause and the effect. The Brezhnev Doctrine before Brezhnev. The paradox was that the Brezhnev Doctrine was actually in effect long before Brezhnev himself came to power. After all, the first case when the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics used military force to suppress discontent among its satellites was recorded in the summer of 1953. At that time, Brezhnev was only the deputy head of the main political directorate of the Soviet Army and Navy, meaning he wasn't even part of the top political elite of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. In Moscow, there was an interregnum. Stalin had died, and Khrushchev was still vying for power with Beria and Malenkov. During these turbulent days, German workers in East Berlin, dissatisfied with working conditions, staged an uprising. Just think about it. In a workers' and peasants' state, the workers rose up against the workers' government. It's quite a paradox. Nevertheless, that was the reality. It began as strikes over unfairly raised production quotas. But on June 18, 1953, the protests took on a distinctly political character. The demonstrators called for the German Democratic Republic government and trade union leadership to resign, free elections, the participation of Western parties, and even German reunification, which at that time was completely unthinkable. The insurgents often smashed police stations and prisons, releasing prisoners, and at many enterprises, spontaneous strike committees and workers' councils emerged, taking power into their own hands. In a word, it might have seemed to many that the days of Soviet power in the German Democratic Republic were numbered. Essentially, the people had sentenced their government to death.
But for Moscow, these events were not a popular uprising, but rather some kind of fascist raid and coup.
And the attitude toward them was accordingly. Soviet army units were used to suppress the protests. Fortunately, the largest Soviet force in Europe was based in the German Democratic Republic, and Soviet tanks were used against the peaceful population. And as a result, no fewer than 55 German citizens were killed. However, this figure is likely underestimated. Many of the arrested protesters were later subjected to show trials, and some were even executed by firing squad to serve as a warning to others. And the German Democratic Republic remained under Moscow's heel until the fall of the Berlin Wall and the reunification of Germany. An even bloodier case of Moscow interfering in another country's internal affairs was the brutal, even by the standards of that time, suppression of the revolution in Hungary in 1956. Orban somehow never mentions this, by the way. So, just 3 years after the events in Berlin, the situation here became as politicized as possible, and the people's anger erupted against the one-party pro-Soviet regime. People stood for freedom and democratic reforms, for the revival of a multi-party system, for holding elections on an alternative basis, for ending political repression and the forced imposition of the only correct communist ideology. And, what was most dangerous for Moscow, the Hungarians demanded the withdrawal of Soviet troops from their country. As always happens, the revolution began with peaceful protests that swept through Budapest on October 23rd. But very quickly, the demonstrations escalated into armed clashes and even street fighting. Because of a certain indecisiveness of the Hungarian communist authorities, who were simply shocked by the scale of the people's anger. At first, luck was on the side of the rebels. Most of the local party leadership fled under the warm wing to Moscow, and the temporary government was headed by Imre Nagy, who was known for his rather progressive views. The first thing they did was release all political prisoners, restore the multi-party system, and form a coalition government. It was also announced that free elections would be held soon. Naturally, Moscow couldn't tolerate this outcome. But what she definitely couldn't tolerate was Imre Nagy's declaration that Hungary would leave the Warsaw Pact and proclaim itself a neutral state, following the example of neighboring Austria. This absolutely could not be allowed, otherwise other Soviet satellites might follow such a contagious example. And once again, Soviet tanks were brought in. The Hungarians put up fierce resistance against the aggressor, but the forces were far too unequal. The main centers of resistance were suppressed within a week, but many rebel groups went underground. Soviet aggression cost at least 3,000 Hungarian civilian lives. Due to the revolution's suppression, a more compliant and controllable János Kádár took power. Prime Minister Imre Nagy, who was sympathetic to the rebels, was labeled a traitor to communism and executed. It's a little-known fact, but the Hungarian Revolution had a positive impact on the careers of two famous historical figures, Georgy Zhukov and Yuri Andropov. The Marshal of Victory, also known as the Butcher of all times and peoples, was awarded his fourth Hero of the Soviet Union Star for crushing the Hungarian rebels. Formally, Zhukov received the hero title a month later in connection with his 60th birthday. However, everyone knew perfectly well what this award was really for. The Butcher was also a butcher in Hungary. Andropov, later head of the State Security Committee and General Secretary, was the Soviet ambassador to Hungary in 1956, and from the very first day of the protests, he advocated for their harshest suppression. Later, his firm stance was appreciated, leading to his promotion to the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, which paved the way for his rise to power. So, what conclusions can be drawn? First of all, the Brezhnev Doctrine was not really Brezhnev's. It was a universal doctrine that legitimized Soviet aggressive ambitions. Regardless of who was sitting in the warm Kremlin offices, Stalin, Khrushchev, Brezhnev, or his unlucky successors. And most importantly, it couldn't have been any other way. Soviet general secretaries allowed their satellites to play at independence only as long as it didn't contradict Moscow's interests. The short-lived Prague Spring. The most classic application of the Brezhnev Doctrine was the events of 1968 in Czechoslovakia, better known as the Prague Spring. At first glance, they had a number of similarities with the Hungarian Revolution. However, they were not as radical, and accordingly, the number of victims was incomparably smaller. It all started when Alexander Dubček became first secretary of the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia. He began a series of liberal reforms aimed at expanding the rights and freedoms of citizens and decentralizing power in the country. But, unlike in Hungary, these reforms did not affect the one-party regime and communist ideology at all. And essentially, their goal was to modernize the existing system, to make it more flexible and adaptable to the demands of the times. Dubček called his policy socialism with a human face. This phrase later became a catchphrase and outlived its author by a long time. Later, Gorbachev's reforms were similarly presented, as were Deng Xiaoping's changes in the People's Republic of China, labeled socialism with Chinese characteristics. In Moscow, however, socialism with a human face was not valued. For supporters of orthodox Marxism-Leninism, which included Brezhnev himself and his entire Politburo, any, even minor, changes to the socio-political system of the state they were used to, considering their own, were completely unacceptable. The situation worsened because the new Czechoslovak authorities never considered altering their foreign policy or distancing themselves from Soviet influence, unlike Hungary 12 years earlier. Dubček was absolutely loyal to Moscow, but in his own country, as Soviet newspapers wrote, he allowed inexcusable leniency toward anti-socialist views and sentiments, which spilled out in the press, on radio, and on television due to the loosening of censorship. Many party bosses in Brezhnev's circle called the Prague Spring a creeping counter-revolution. It was noted that the local Communist Party was gradually losing its authority, while society was more inclined to listen to liberal-minded members of the intelligentsia. All these processes could eventually lead to the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics losing control over Czechoslovakia, and so the empire struck back. On August 21, 1968, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics began Operation Danube, sending troops into Czechoslovakia and replacing its leaders with more compliant communists. In addition to the Soviet army, small military contingents from Poland, Hungary, East Germany and Bulgaria also took part in this punitive action. They justified their aggression by claiming the necessity of collective responsibility in defending socialism. Upon learning about the invasion, Dubček condemned the actions of the Allied states, considering them a violation of international law. However, in his radio address to the people of Czechoslovakia, Dubček urged citizens to remain calm and to avoid bloodshed, and a repeat of the events in Hungary in 1956. A few hours later, he and his entourage were arrested by Soviet paratroopers and sent to Moscow. Actually, the paratroopers played the key role in this aggression. Military transport planes landed at the airfields unimpeded, and airborne troops swiftly seized key administrative and infrastructure buildings. That's why many modern experts directly state that when planning their special operation in Ukraine, Putin and his henchmen were actually basing it on the analysis of the events of '68, when control over an entire country was established in just a few hours. But the main thing they counted on was the lack of centralized resistance, as well as a certain disorganization and demoralization of the authorities, which was definitely not the case in Ukraine in February of '22. Another attempt to copy a half-forgotten experience ended in complete failure. What worked in Prague was doomed to fail near Kyiv. Naturally, bloodshed in Czechoslovakia was far less severe. The short-lived reformer Dubček was not executed, but merely removed from all positions, and replaced by a typical party conservative Soviet-style Gustav Husak. At the same time, there were no mass repressions against the protesters. However, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics once again demonstrated its aggressive face to the whole world, and it definitely wasn't a human one. Afghan and Warsaw. Usually the term Brezhnev Doctrine is used only in relation to European countries, to Moscow's Eastern European vassals. But once it was actually applied to a country located deep in Central Asia, and that country was Afghanistan. I will deliberately not discuss the circumstances and events that led to the start of the Afghan war. There are several good videos on the channel dedicated to this topic or other aspects of this issue. I will just remind you that in 1979, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics considered Afghanistan as its sphere of influence, and there were significant doubts about the loyalty of its then leader, Hafizullah Amin. So they decided to replace him with a more loyal party member, Babrak Karmal, while simultaneously bringing in a limited Soviet military contingent. And the fact that ordinary people did not accept this puppet regime and started a bloody guerrilla war against it only confirmed the weakness and short-sightedness of Brezhnev's doctrine. The 10-year Afghan war and the subsequent wars confirm this fact once again. However, that's a completely different story. The last time the Brezhnev Doctrine was implemented, although not fully, was in 1981 in Poland. Back then, it did not come to a full-scale deployment of Soviet troops. However, such a possibility was quite real. That year, Poland faced its worst political crisis since the communist dictatorship began. Those dissatisfied with the current state of affairs created the independent trade union Solidarity, which acted as a coordinating body for the protesters, and the Poles were protesting against numerous problems that the ruling regime could not and did not even want to solve. Ordinary workers demanded better working conditions, higher wages, shorter working hours, and improved food supplies. More radical demonstrators demanded the release of all political prisoners, freedom of speech and assembly, and the abolition of privileges for the party elite. And although, as in the case of Czechoslovakia, there was no real threat of Poland breaking away from Soviet control, Moscow still would not relent. The fact that all the protests were purely internal in nature did not reassure the Kremlin elders at all. Brezhnev actively pressured the Polish leadership to suppress any acts of civil resistance as quickly as possible. And in this case, the Polish leadership decided to act preemptively in order to prevent a Soviet intervention. The new leader of the Polish Communist Party, General Wojciech Jaruzelski, decided to act on his own. And on the night of December 13, 1981, he imposed martial law throughout Poland, which lasted until July 1983. All protests were declared illegal. Mass arrests of Solidarity leaders began, as well as of anyone who resisted the authorities. It should be noted that as a result of almost 2 years of martial law in Poland, the ruling post-Soviet regime was generally able to stabilize the situation in the country. According to various estimates, between 56 and 122 protesters were killed. Jaruzelski himself remained convinced until the end of his life that he chose the lesser evil, since by doing so he prevented a Soviet military invasion and the inevitable larger-scale bloodshed. But since the underlying reasons that brought people to the streets were not resolved, this stabilization was only temporary. The old problems resurfaced again in 1989 and eventually led to the so-called Velvet Revolution and the overthrow of Jaruzelski's regime. Maybe I should make a separate video about these events. What do you think? Write in the comments. The fall of the Brezhnev Doctrine. The Brezhnev Doctrine's decline largely matches the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics' own decline, and more specifically, with the decrease in real resources needed to keep its satellites under control. This control required huge costs. Consider the supply of oil and gas at prices much lower than what Moscow charged the Federal Republic of Germany and other declining capitalist countries. Russia is currently using the oil and gas lever effectively against Lukashenko's Belarus. The ever-intensifying arms race with the United States demanded even more spending. The Strategic Defense Initiative, announced in 1983 by President Reagan and better known as the Star Wars program, essentially forced Moscow to consider deploying its missile weapons in space as well. This would have depleted the already small budget and could have eventually left the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics bankrupt. To make things worse, the unreliable Arabs let them down. The Saudis, following the puppet of the imperialists and Reagan, unexpectedly increased oil production. This caused crude oil and petroleum prices to drop sharply, cutting off the high-tech union's main source of income, petrodollars. The unmatched generosity auction had ended. So being a global hegemon required colossal financial, material and technical resources, which the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics did not possess. Unlike the aging Brezhnev Politburo, Mikhail Gorbachev, who took power in 1985, understood this situation better than anyone else. Therefore, he was forced to act in two directions: to reduce payments to freeloaders from the so-called socialist camp and to increase budget revenues by carrying out economic reforms, which included introducing market mechanisms and legalizing private entrepreneurship. By the late 80s, the situation was out of control. The Soviet Union faced a deep socio-economic crisis, soon followed by a political one. In turn, the Eastern European countries that were left without serious support from Moscow eventually gained true independence and went their own way. These events went down in history as the Velvet Revolutions of 1989 or the Autumn of Nations. 2 years later, the Soviet Empire was only a memory. And the Brezhnev Doctrine was irreversibly buried in the dustbin of history. Unfortunately, not forever. Instead of the Brezhnev Doctrine, now there is the Putin Doctrine. As is well known, in the 1990s, Russia lost a significant part of its influence in the post-Soviet space and in the world as a whole. What's so surprising about that? Being in such an economic mess and with the total degradation of almost all political institutions, Moscow simply had no real opportunities to pursue any geopolitical ambitions. But when the so-called gatherer of Russian lands and hapless Chekist rose to power in 1999, the situation changed dramatically. And although there is no single document called the Putin Doctrine, the foreign policy strategy of Putin's Russia has always been subordinated to achieving one overarching goal: the revival of the Soviet Empire, the creation of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics 2.0. In fact, from the very first years of the Balding Dwarf's rule, it became clear that he did not take seriously the right of post-Soviet countries to live their own lives and solve their own problems independently. Just remember how Putin reacted to the Rose Revolution in Georgia and the Orange Revolution in Ukraine. I'm not even mentioning Euromaidan. In short, under the leadership of the valiant Vladimir Vladimirovich, Russia did nothing but limit the independence of the former Soviet republics, especially those that started to look to the West. Besides Ukraine and Georgia, this includes Moldova and the Baltic countries. Putin has a special attitude toward the latter, since they managed to slip out of the Kremlin's grasp in time and become full-fledged members of the Euro-Atlantic community. At the same time, instead of the completely outdated communist ideology, as was the case with the Brezhnev Doctrine, modern Russia uses a more flexible concept of protecting the Russian-speaking population and the Russian world as a justification for interfering in the internal affairs of neighboring states. This is especially evident in the case of the annexation of Crimea in 2014 and the support of separatist movements in Donbass. Moscow sees control over the Russian-speaking post-Soviet space as a way to counter Western influence and strengthen Russia's position in Europe and in the whole world in general. And finally, what dictatorship can do without the image of a vile and treacherous enemy? That's right, none. The image of an enemy can be used both to consolidate society, to carry out repressions, and to justify the need for a dictatorial model of government. And what should you do when there is no enemy? That means you have to invent one. Just like with the Brezhnev Doctrine, Putin, in his own doctrine, views the so-called collective West as an irreconcilable adversary. And first and foremost, the NATO bloc. It's no coincidence he cites NATO's eastward expansion as the main reason for attacking Ukraine, though the real cause was actually the Russian Federation's expansion westward. This should be well remembered by the current generation and all future generations. That's all I have. Thank you to all the sponsors for financially supporting the channel, and thanks to all the viewers for watching and commenting. Goodbye everyone.